Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ryan Retro channel. In today's video, I'm going to be guiding you through getting the best performance out of GameHub. I'm going to keep this really simple and easy, and all of the things I do in this video should see you getting better frame rates. You may be able to double, triple, or possibly even more pull your performance in Steam games on Android, as well as games running from your SD card. If you don't know how to get GameHub up and running and installing all your games, check out this tutorial I made a little while ago, which will help you get into this state I'm in now with all your games installed and running and ready to go. I'm going to jump into Monster Hunter Stories for my first example today, because I was only able to get around 30 frames per second in this game in one of my previous videos, and I'd like to increase that by quite a lot. So let's jump into the game and see where we are at by default in GameHub. So jumping into the game, right away we have around 39 frames per second, sometimes going up into the mid-40s, usually settling somewhere in the mid-30s to mid-40s. So I would like to increase this up to 60 frames per second if possible, and maybe even more than that. So let's see what we can do to increase this performance. So we're now going to look into the settings of the game, and we're going to change just a few simple options to give us better performance. So all we need to do is tap on the game once, and then instead of pressing play now, we're going to select these three dots. You can select it with your gamepad, or you can tap on it with your finger, and we're then going to come to the first option, PC Game Settings. Here are all of the settings for your game, and they might look a bit overwhelming because there are quite a lot of them, and some of them have quite confusing names. But don't worry, we're not going to go through all of them today. We're only going to look at a few of them that are simple and work pretty much every time. If you'd like to go further in depth with this, you can check out my website ryanretro.com, where people have listed far greater detail about getting games working perfectly. But for today, we're not going to do that. We're just going to look at something really simple, very self-explanatory and obvious things. So first of all, let's come down to the compatibility tab. That's where we're going to be messing around with today. And there are a lot of confusing looking options, but we're just going to tackle a few simple ones. So first of all, come down to GPU driver. Drivers can have a big difference in how your game performs, and new versions of drivers are generally brought out to improve performance or stability. By default, GameHub will usually pick this turnip driver, 25.0.0 revision 1. That's a driver that's pretty decent, but it's about a year outdated at this point. So we want to change that to a newer, more updated one. So just tap on where it says GPU driver. Once again, you can do all of this with your actual gamepad or with your touchscreen, it doesn't matter. And GameHub lists these drivers from the newest at the top down to the oldest at the bottom. So here we have the Turnip 25.0.0 revision 1, which you will probably also see on your device as well. We simply just want to scroll up to the top of the list and choose the newest Turnip driver. At the very top will be the system driver. Then we'll have Adreno drivers, which you'll use if you don't have a Snapdragon device. But I do have a Snapdragon device and want to make use of the Turnip driver. If you don't know if your phone or handheld has a Snapdragon chipset, you can check out websites like retrocatalog.com, which will list Snapdragon under chipset, or just simply Google, does this phone or handheld have a Snapdragon chipset? Or can I use Turnip drivers with this phone or device? And you'll get your answer right at the top thanks to Gemini AI. So if you do have a Snapdragon device that supports Turnip drivers, you're going to want to pick from the Turnip driver list. And if you have a device that does not support Turnip drivers, you're going to want to choose from the Adreno list, but you're probably not going to have great results, unfortunately. But I'm going to assume a lot of you watching do have a Snapdragon device, as they are the most common ones out there. So we're going to want to just pick whichever is at the top of the Turnip driver list. Here is Turnip 25.3.0 revision 11, and that one at the time of filming was released just a few weeks ago. So I'm going to select that driver now, and let's see if that has improved our frame rate. Now with the new Turnip driver selected, we're at a pretty solid 45 frames per second now, sometimes getting up to nearly 50 and not dropping down into the 30s anymore. Now even rising up into the mid-50s, so we are seeing a slight improvement there. And it will depend on the game you play. Some of them will have a much larger improvement than others, but we do have a noticeable frame rate improvement here. Let's once again go back into the PC game settings, and now let me show you the next tip. Once again, under compatibility, we have translation params, the translation parameters. Let's tap on that, and by default, it will be game preset. This gets you running in a nice, stable way and should work well for most games. But it's not the best performance. As we make our way along this list at the top of the screen from left to right, the right side of the list gives more stability. The game should be less likely to crash and more likely to run in the first place. Whereas the left side of the list gives more performance, and usually higher frame rates. So by changing from game presets up to compatible, stable, performance, or even extreme, we can get higher frames per second, but possibly at the cost of some stability. So if you want the highest frame per second possible, we want to select extreme over here. And if the game is crashing, we then want to work our way down the list to the right-hand side. So I always set every new game to extreme for the best performance. If I get some crashes, I'll move down to performance. If I get crashes again, I'll move down to stable, and so on and so forth. But let's go for extreme and see if we can get a higher frame rate than the 40s and sometimes 50 that we just experienced. So let's once again launch the game now with our extreme parameters and our new driver. In my experience, most games will run fine with the extreme parameters. This game is actually giving an error. So this is a good example where we should quit out of the game, go back to the PC game settings, and change from extreme to performance. And let's try to run it again. With the performance preset, we're now getting a very solid frame rate above 50 frames per second and getting close to the 60 frames per second that I want. Now is a good time to show you how to get the most out of your handheld outside of GameHub. And that is by making sure you're in the highest performance profile possible. If your device is your phone, you might not necessarily have performance profiles. But if you have a dedicated Android handheld with built-in cooling, you probably do have performance profiles to further push the performance. On Retroid and AYN devices, that's going to be in the top pull-down menu. It will say Performance, and by tapping on that, you can choose between Standard, Performance, and High Performance. So by setting High Performance, you should get higher frames per second. On an Neo device like the Conker Pocket Fit here, we can bring in the side panel, and we have these performance modes here, which vary greatly. Eco mode saves battery and really hinders the performance down. So now we're getting only 20 frames per second in Eco mode. I've been running this video so far in balanced mode, so we're getting around 50 frames per second as we saw previously. We can increase that to gaming mode or even maximum mode. And on the Conker Pocket Fit, and I believe other ANEO devices, in maximum mode, we're able to lock our GPU at its maximum frequency at all times. I believe you can do this on other devices as well if you root them and install apps to do that for you, but here on ANEO devices, you can just toggle this on and lock the maximum frequency at all times, which really helps with performance. So in balanced mode, we were getting around 50 frames per second, but when I move this into maximum performance mode, you're going to see this immediately go straight up to 59 and stop. And that is because GameHub automatically restricts your game to 60 frames per second. So here is my next tip if you have a device with a screen refresh rate above 60 Hz. And that will be to unlock the frame cap put on by GameHub. So if you have something like a Retroid Pocket 5 that can only show 60 frames per second anyway, we will just keep this frame cap on. But my Conker Pocket Fit here can show 144 frames per second, and I want to get a lot closer to that than 59. So now that I have maximum speed and I'm using the newest driver and the performance preset, I now want to uncap the frame rate in GameHub. So to do that, you're either going to swipe from off the screen and onto the screen, like this to bring up the GameHub menu, or hit the back button on your phone or other device, which will bring up this menu. You're going to come down to this little graph icon, the second one, and then where it says Enable Frame Limit, which is set to 60 frames per second, we're going to turn that off. And we have now unlocked the frame rate. And if you do have a device with a higher than 60 Hz refresh rate, you're also going to want to go into your game settings and make sure that VSync is turned off. VSync will try to lock your game to 60 frames per second. So by turning that off, and increasing the FPS limit to match your device, or even higher or unlimited, you're then going to see the highest frames per second you can get out of each game. So I've now gone from 59 frames per second to 90 frames per second. This of course can fluctuate as you go throughout the game, but we've gone from getting around 30 to 40 frames per second to getting above 80, and I've experienced well above 100 in this game as well. So let's now apply these same changes to other games and see how they affect them. For all of these game tests, I'll keep my performance mode on maximum, and I will turn off the frame limit. Then we're going to see what performance increases we can get by just using a new driver and the extreme performance profile. Here is Megabonk, and by default, without changing anything in GameHub, we're getting around 50 to 60 frames per second. With the extreme translation parameters and the latest driver, we are now getting over 100 frames per second, sometimes dipping around to the 90s, sometimes going above 110, a nice 40 to 50 frame per second boost. Here is Hades 2 with the game preset translation parameters and default driver, and we're getting around 88 to around 110 frames per second. We are getting some frame dips here and there, but it runs very well right out of the box and feels so smooth. With our extreme translation parameters and the latest driver, we're now getting between 160 and 180 frames per second. We're able to maintain above our 144 frame per second refresh rate. And rather than dropping down into the 80s, we're only dropping down into the 130s. With Hades 2 going so well, it will be no surprise that Hades 1 is kind of ridiculous. Even with the default settings here, we're getting over 200 frames per second, sometimes above 300, and almost always at least in the 210s. I am seeing some dips now into the 190s, but even on default settings, this just runs so well. But let's see if we can get even more frames per second by using the newer driver and those extreme translation parameters. Here we don't see as big of a change as we do in other titles. Still around the 230s, so only around a 20 frame per second gain. But of course, anything above 144 Hz isn't going to be used by my device's screen anyway. So on this occasion, Hades doesn't really have much improving to do. Hollow Knight Silksong is another game that's running at around 240 frames per second, so once again doesn't really need any help from these changes. But let's just see what happens when we go from the default driver and game preset translation parameters. We're getting around 240 to 260 frames per second, and with our changes, we're now getting around 300 frames per second. So again, around a 50 frames per second boost there, but one that wasn't really necessary. So let's recap how to get the best performance in GameHub on your Android device. First of all, make sure you're in the highest performance profile possible, which will give you the best performance, of course. Then inside GameHub itself, come into the game's settings and make sure that you have the newest driver selected, whether that's a Turnip driver if your device supports it, or the latest Adreno driver if that's what your device supports. Then also come into the translation parameters and set it to extreme. If it's crashing or unstable, make your way down this list from left to right, becoming slightly less performant but more stable as you make your way down. I find that extreme works in most cases, but sometimes I do need to make my way down to performance, and in some very rare cases, I do need to make my way all the way down to stable or compatible to make a game run in a stable fashion. Once you do that, you should have improved performance. And if you'd like to get more than 60 frames per second, come into the in-game GameHub menu and disable frame limit, and also go into your game's options and make sure that VSync is disabled. That will then unlock the frame rate and you can get super high frame rates like this. I hope this video was helpful and I hope you're now gaming with the highest frame rate of your life. If that is the case, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Remember, subscribe to Ryan Retro to get more frames in your games. I'm never saying that again.